think this is a very interesting and very important initiative, especially at a time where, because of the mounting budget constraints in many developed countries, in Europe in particular, there is some threat on what will happen with development aid. And also at a time where in many countries something developed which is called aid fatigue, with the public opinion not so much convinced that aid is so important and so effective in accelerating development. At the same time, I must say that in academia, in the graduate studies, we see in economics more and more students who are interested by development. This is true in Europe, more or less everywhere in Europe. This is also true in the US. And I think it is a very encouraging sign that there is a growing sense of development being important in the global community. Okay, what I would like to talk about today is not probably the most frequent topic in the debate about development and development policy. It is about inequality, I guess a concept which should resonate rather well in Nordic countries like Denmark. I should add, in the connection to the introduction by Lars, that I will be referring to inequality within countries. I will not refer to countries between across countries. This is another issue. He cited the Human Development Report. I'm not sure I agree completely with this report, but I will refrain from getting into a debate on this. Now, there has been very, very much progress over the last 15 years or so in the academic community about understanding what is the relationship between inequality, and we'll get in just a moment to how do we define inequality, and development, and maybe economic growth. And somehow this work, this progress, has not yet has not diffused yet in the policy community. And I believe that from that point of view, there is really very much to be said. The implications of the work done are, I believe, far-reaching, although we are not completely clear about what they precisely are. And part of this lecture is really about trying to draw some lessons from all this work which is done by academics around the world. And the implications in terms of development policy and in terms of development aid policy, I think, are important. And this might be a good introduction to the roundtable that will follow, and to the presentation that will be made of some of the conclusions of the European Development Report on social protection. But let me go on and first say something about why inequality is important in development. For a very long time, development was considered as almost synonymous of economic growth. And people were simply judging development by the growth of GDP per capita. We'll not get into why GDP may not be the right measure, but something like an aggregate measure like GDP per capita. Then some people say, we are not so much interested by GDP growth per se, because GDP grows also in rich countries. So we are more interested by GDP growth in poor countries, and as a matter of fact, we're interested by poverty, or more exactly by poverty reduction. The idea being that faster growth of GDP per capita, faster resorption of poverty. Now, and for a long time, this has been really the view. People were trying to work on poverty reduction, were trying to act for accelerated poverty reduction, but basically they were trying to influence economic growth. In the World Bank, in the entrance of the World Bank, you know that there is this big sign saying, our dream is a world without poverty. So this is fine. But when you talk to people within the bank, then you discover that most of the people, what they have in mind is a world where GDP grows at a very fast speed. And my point, it is not exactly the same thing. And we can see that very clearly, doing a very simple thought experiment. If we are in a country where everybody's income grows exactly at the same rate, let's say 5% a year, then inequality in that country will not change. Basically because somebody who had twice the income of somebody else will keep having twice the income of that somebody else forever. Yet in that country, poverty is going down because you have more and more people who will be jumping over the poverty line, if the poverty line, of course, is set in absolute terms, like what the United Nations, the UNDP does, or the World Bank does, when they say that the poverty line in the world should be $1.25 a day per person. Then it is quite clear that there is, in that case, a complete simple relationship between growth on the one hand and poverty on the other. But now if we imagine that over time the distribution of income changes, as it has done in several countries, as it is doing in one of the richest countries in the world, like the United States, in a tremendous way. If, like in the United States, growth over the last 20 years has been more or less confiscated by the top 10% of the whole distribution, then clearly there will be no progress. Growth will produce no progress in terms of poverty. And this is the reason why we have to understand what is the relationship between inequality, changes in inequality, possibly, and development. The way in which development is influencing, or the type of development is influencing inequality, and the way in which inequality itself is influencing the rate and the structure of economic growth in the society. And this is the reason why it is so important, if we study development, to emphasize inequality. I put on this slide a last point here, which I think is important and will also be kind of will be emphasized repeatedly in my presentation. It is this idea, which is due to Amartya Sen, of seeing development as freedom. As freedom of what? Simply as freedom for people to do what they would like to do what they are physically, intellectually able to do without restrictions being set by the society in which they live, without restrictions set by the circumstances in which they live. And this is a concept of development which is quite interesting because it leads to a concept of inequality which is different from the income inequality I just mentioned, and which will prove to be very important to understand the relationship between inequality and development. In the economic literature, there is a long tradition trying to relate income inequality to development. Some people have worked in the 70s in particular about the way in which GDP per capita could influence, could determine the level of income inequality. Later on, mostly during the 90s, people have worked on the way in which inequality, the degree of inequality, was affecting the rate of growth of the economy. I'll say a little more about this in just a moment, but this certainly is a reflection on which we would like to draw. Another, and this really corresponds to this remark I made about development as freedom, another view at inequality is inequality of opportunities rather than inequality of outcomes, inequality of income, inequality of opportunities, or the circumstances in which people have to earn a living, circumstances in which people can raise their children, etc., etc. And this is rather new. I would say that this is a movement, a reflection that developed in academic literature during the 2000s, and of course this is an aspect on which I would like to emphasize in this presentation. So the presentation is really about how do we put all these aspects of inequality and development together? How do we articulate income, opportunities, economic growth, the structure of economic growth, the pace of economic growth, to get the overall picture of the relationship between inequality and development. And of course, if we're able to do something like that, what are the implications of this for development policy? And in particular, what is the importance of social policies in general as part of a development strategy, and as opposed to more traditional policies which are more focused toward infrastructure, toward the trade openness of the economy, etc., etc. And the point I will try to make is that indeed social policies are an essential part of any development strategy. Now, what are the implications also for development aid, which is a natural second question after knowing what the implications for development policy, to the extent that development aid may help promoting and developing some policies, a development strategy. And finally, a very important point that I want to make before I really get into the matter. The way we look at inequality in all that literature, in the debate about development in general, is very often from an ethical point of view. When we say equality is good per se, an equitable world is something we should be striving at. This is fine, and I will certainly not go against that view. I think that there are many here who share exactly that view. But the point on which I want to insist, and which is not so clear in the mind of many people, is the fact that not only inequality is something important from a normative point of view, but it is important also from a positive point of view. In other words, it is possible that a society which is more equal, more equitable in some sense that we'll have to define later on, may be able to develop faster and in a better way than a country where initially we have a lot of inequity, a lot of inequality. So there are really two aspects: the normative aspect, which is in the back of our minds and which is something which is granted, but there is also the positive aspect, which is not so well understood by people in the development debate, and this is the point on which I would like to insist. So this is the outline of this presentation. I will review briefly some theoretical relationship between inequality and development, insisting first on the various dimensions of inequality and on the various channels through which inequality and development are linked. Second, I will say a few words about the existing evidence on that relationship between inequality and development. And finally, I will be tackling a couple of points related to redistribution policies and the implications of all these for development aid policy. Okay, let me start with various dimensions of inequality. The first definition should be referring to outcomes of economic activity. It is the most traditional one. It is income as a result of economic activity. It may be consumption per capita. It may be different concepts. What we're trying to get at in general is something which is close to economic welfare and inequality in economic welfare, with various ways of measuring economic welfare. So this is really the end of the economic systems. Markets have worked, people have interacted on these markets, and at the end we observe that they were able to get to secure for themselves some resources, and this is that inequality that we measure. Now we may want to get into the detail of that, and we might want to focus on earnings inequality as one component of what determines overall welfare inequality in the country. We may want to focus on the inequality of property income. This is really part of what is needed in order to understand the way in which inequality of outcomes is generated. Many people would like to make a distinction between analyzing inequality and analyzing poverty. I personally tend to think that these are really very dual concepts. First, poverty is essentially inequality when we look at the distribution of income at the bottom, when we look at the bottom, to the bottom of the distribution of income. It is really the fate of people who are in the first deciles of the distribution, and maybe we don't need to look at the top of the distribution. But people who say that they would be happy in a country with a lot of inequality, and at the same time poverty that would be declining very quickly, forget the fact that if the country is very unequal and is becoming very unequal, this means that people at the top are getting a huge share of the growth of that economy, and certainly poverty would be declining still faster if it were possible to transfer income from the top to the bottom. So it is extremely difficult, as I said before, to make a distinction between poverty and inequality and to say, I'm only interested in poverty and I don't want to hear about inequality. They are very much linked, but it is true that we might put more emphasis on the fate of the people who are below the poverty line than on other people. But again, this distinction is important. Many people would also insist on the fact that when we measure inequality of incomes, of consumption per capita, etc., we have a static view. We observe people at one point of time, and what we should do is observing people at, over a period of time to see whether there is a lot of fluctuation, some volatility of their situation. If this is the case that somebody who is receiving a low income at one point of time is receiving a higher income at another point of time, maybe this is not too serious, and maybe we should ignore this simply by averaging over a period of time the level of income. Now, we may also want to take into account the fact that some people who, for some reason, fall below some level of income are becoming extremely vulnerable to various shocks that may happen to them. They may get into some kind of poverty trap from which it will be difficult to get out because they will have to sell their assets, for example, and then they will be unable to get back to a normal level of income. So it is true that because of the data available, we tend to focus on the static view at inequality, whereas it would be better to look at a dynamic view. Unfortunately, especially in developing countries, we don't have the data to work with that. Finally, I want to insist on something which I believe is really very important. We are only realizing that these days, the fact that the perception of inequality may be different from objective measures of inequality. People may believe or may feel that they live in a very unequal society. They may feel that they live in a society where inequality is increasing, whereas analysts, economists, statisticians will say, no, this country has no increase in inequality, but what is behind that may be either a misperception by the public opinion, but it may also be differences in concept in the way in which people see inequality. And I would like to give you some example of this discrepancy between actual measures of inequality or the evolution of inequality and perception. Here you have the evolution of inequality in 4 countries in the world. 2 BRICS and 2 developed countries. At the top you have Brazil, which is known to be one of the most unequal countries in the world. And you observe the evolution of inequality as measured, of income, as measured by the Gini coefficient between 1980 and these days, more or less. And we see that it's more or less flat, except for the fact that at the end, inequality is going down. The second one is the US. It is a rather unequal country. And moreover, you can see that there is a kind of steady increase in the level of inequality in the US over the, almost all the period. The third country is China, another emerging country, where inequality is increasing. Here you have 2 curves for China. You have China rural and urban China, basically because the way in which they are combined in in some statistical work is not satisfactory. We have problem in measuring purchasing power parity of the rural Chinese versus urban Chinese, and this is the reason why I prefer to keep those two curves. But in any case, we see that inequality is increasing. And finally, we have a rather egalitarian country, European country, Netherlands. I didn't choose a Nordic country to make sure that we are not at the extreme of the range. Netherlands seem to me more or less at the middle between the north and the south. And we have a country where there is little inequality, and inequality is increasing, but very, very slightly. Now, what do people think about inequality in those countries? In a recent poll, which was taken in the 2008, sorry, there was this question to people. They polled 20 countries, but those 4 countries were in the group. The question was, today, would you say that your society is just? Then you have answers which are completely obvious. And you say, okay, the perception corresponds to objective information. Another, where it is much less the case. In Brazil, you can see that at the top, people say, there are many people saying this society is completely unjust. And if you add the not at all and the rather no, you see that there is more than 80% of the Brazilians believe that the society is completely unjust. In China, despite the fact that the level of inequality is much, much less in China, you still have many people who consider that the society is unjust. In Netherlands, we seem to be in a situation where the people have a clear view about the society, and they are aware of the fact that they live in a society which is more or less egalitarian and therefore just. And in the United States, very surprising, a very inegalitarian country in comparison with the European country, and yet people find that their society is completely just. Okay? Now the second question is, how do you feel that inequality in your country has changed over the last 10 years? And again, we have very surprising results here. If we start from the extreme right, the United States, we know that inequality has increased in the United States, and very, very much so. We have data on this which are quite striking. And only less than 50% of the people say inequality has increased. Okay? So they basically ignore this. On the contrary, in Netherlands, where inequality is low, it may have increased, but very, very slightly. Then we have 60% of the people who say inequality has increased over the last 10 years. Okay? And again, what is behind that is not people certainly are not looking at the curves that I've shown before in order to answer that question. In Brazil, where inequality has decreased, and this is an historical event, we'll come back to that in a little later. It is an historical event in a country so unequal, where the Gini coefficient has been so high for so long, over the last 10 years, not only because of Lula, but also because of other reasons, inequality has gone down. Yet people say, no, I mean, inequality kept increasing in this country, and this is not bearable. And in China, where indeed inequality has increased, we cannot say that there is contradiction, because indeed some people find that inequality has increased. So it is interesting to see that behind this very standard poll, we see that there is a discrepancy between perception and objective measures of inequality, which lead us to believe that there may be some conceptual issues, some conceptual differences in the way in which we think about inequality. And one possible difference is that many people may have in mind some other type of inequality, inequality of opportunities. In the words of Amartya Sen, when he was presenting his well-known concept of capabilities, capabilities was essentially the set of outcomes that people could reach given the circumstances that they were facing and on which they had absolutely no power. Now, if we try to get to more practical definitions, then opportunities would comprise different aspects. Endowments, the assets that people have to work with, their wealth, maybe their talent, their education, their health. It should include unequal access or equal access to some facilities like credit, like schools, like justice, in order to have protection of their property rights, like healthcare. It must include the way in which some markets are working. Is there discrimination against a gender or against an ethnic group in the society? Are there such discriminations on other markets, for example, the housing market? And this is, again, modifying the set of capabilities of the people, the set of opportunities that people have. And voice is really very important too. Is it the case that people have a saying in when a decision is made on the public goods which they will be sharing at the local, at the regional, or at the national level? Is it the case that people can express their view and their view is taken into account? This is the democratic aspect of societies. Now, what I want to show now is that those two types of inequality, ex ante opportunities, ex post outcomes, are part of the general relationship between inequality and development. And this chart shows the various dimensions of the inequality and development relationship. You start on this chart from the left. On the left, you have the distribution of opportunities. You have the distribution of endowments in the population. Some people are rich, they have land. Some other people are absolutely landless. They didn't inherit anything from their parents. Some people have gone to school, some others have not. And all this is determining the opportunities of the people in the functioning of the economy. Given that those opportunities, people get into the economic system, they exchange goods, services, work, labor, etc. On markets, and this is determining the level of production in that economy. This is determining the structure of that production. This is determining the way in which that economy grows. And at the same time, this is determining the distribution of outcomes in the population. Now, what is very important to see here is that you see that what is determining the distribution of outcomes, the exposed distribution, and what is determining the level of activity and the structure of activity in the economy is the same thing. I mean, the root of all this is the distribution of opportunities. So the point of departure should be the distribution of opportunities. Now, is it the end of the story? Not really, because this is not a relationship that goes on in one direction. This is a two-directional relationship, because now we have the feedback from the distribution of outcomes to the distribution of opportunities. What people do with the income they get. They can accumulate through savings. They can spend money on the accumulation of human capital for their children. They can accumulate for transmitting to their children more wealth. And this is in turn determining the evolution of the distribution of opportunities in the society. So in order to understand the relationship between inequality and development, you have those two aspects, two types of inequality, which are interacting with each other with a kind of primary factor, which is the distribution of opportunities, determining the level and the structure of economic activity and the distribution of outcomes, and then the feedback through the accumulation of factors. So it is absolutely essential to understand that. It is essential to understand that you might not go very far if you simply want to modify the distribution of outcomes through some taxes and transfers. Because as long as you are not able to affect in any real way, in any deep way, the distribution of opportunities, you might not be modifying very much the inequality in the society. You might not change very much the impact of that inequality on GDP growth. You might not change the perception that people have of inequality. Let me give you a very simple example, which is taken from our society in Europe. In many countries in Europe, we now have very safe income guarantee schemes that guarantee that people will not get, the income of the people will not get below some level. Now we could say that because of that, we have made a big progress when we decided to implement those policies toward more inequality, more equality, I'm sorry, and that people should be satisfied because in any case they will not be able to fall below some kind of subsistence level. Now, when you ask people about whether because of that we are living in a more egalitarian world, people are telling you no. The problem is not so much for me to get the money, to get the minimum income, whatever the name it is given in the country we are looking at. What matters for me is the fact that I'm not able to get a job. And because of that, I'm socially excluded from society. So you can see that only because of that, people may feel that there is a lot of inequality in terms of access to the labor market, and at the same time, this kind of measure is reducing inequality in terms of income. And all this is there. We should say that the first type of inequality is an inequality of opportunities, and this inequality of opportunities does not necessarily lead to an inequality of outcomes because there is some kind of policy which is present there. And this is the whole complex and circular relationship that we would like to understand. Okay, let me, because I already said several things about this, I can go quickly on that slide. Of course, in the major inequality development channels, the pace and the structure of economic growth plays a role through the rewards of factors, by type of factor, skilled and unskilled labor, where labor is located, etc. It depends on the structure of markets, the degree of competition on the market, the lack of discrimination in markets. We have all the channel through factor accumulation, savings. Okay, I will not get into the detail of that. This would be too long, but I have a story about how you can explain the 2008-9 crisis through an excess inequality in a country in the world, of course, the United States. But I refrain from doing that. Maybe we can come back to that in the round table. Accumulation of human capital, of course, and the correction of market failures, and the political economy, the fact that I just said redistribution policy might be completely endogenous, and we know that in a country where there is too much inequality, in some sense, there may be social tensions, there may be conflict. It's very interesting from that point of view to see that people who have worked on conflicts, trying to explain conflicts by inequality, and one of them is Paul Collier in his earlier work on the conflict. It was a complete failure. I mean, it's impossible to explain conflicts in a country by the degree of inequality of income. But it is quite possible to explain conflicts by horizontal inequality, and the fact that some ethnic groups do not have access to some facilities and other groups do have access. So again, this shows that it is a complete system which matters. Let me say now a few words about the available evidence on the relationship between inequality and development. Now, if we have in mind this circular relationship, this circular representation of the relationship between inequality and development, it may be somewhat surprising to see that what statisticians, sociologists, economists have done over the last 20 years, or maybe a little more, 30 years, is really to look only at the right-hand side of that relationship. They essentially look at the relationship between the inequality of outcomes and economic growth, or the level of GDP, or the mean level of income. The first set of work is what has been called the Kuznets curve in the literature. Kuznets simply proposed a very simple model saying looking at the United States, looking at Germany, looking at a couple of the history of some countries, easier as to say, in the first stage of development, inequality tends to increase because people move from all being very poor to only some, and some becoming rich, and more people becoming rich, meaning that the inequality is increasing. And when you have more and more people being rich, then inequality decreases. So is the Kuznets curve or the inverted U curve say that there is a relationship between the level of development and inequality. Then some people tried to check whether this was true, looking across countries, and they found, initially they found, oh yes, this law does work, and then more refined statistical work showed that this was really not significant, and there was, as a matter of fact, no significant relationship of this type. And it would be much better to look at that relationship doing country analysis, maybe in the same way as Kuznets had done, trying to understand the way in which the country is growing and changing over time in order to see the relationship between the evolution of the level of development and inequality, but there would be no general law. Later, there was this analysis which was going in the opposite direction, starting from, again, outcomes, inequality of income, and the impact of that on the growth of GDP. Was it the case that more unequal countries would grow slower than more unequal countries, more equal countries, or would it be the opposite? And then again, initially, people found that there seemed to be some negative relationship between the degree of inequality in a country and the rate of growth of that country. And this really started some movement in even in the development community, saying, oh, no, we just found that more inequality is really bad for development. Now we have evidence of that. Now again, when people started to work more seriously on the data, they found that that relationship was really, if it existed, very weak, and for some people it was completely insignificant. Now, we can understand to some extent why, given this circle. Because clearly, if we want to look at the impact of inequality on growth, we have to take into account the accumulation of factors, we have to take into account the left-hand side of that circle. We have to look at the distribution of opportunities. And as a matter of fact, all the theoretical models which have been developed in order to justify those statistical work trying to relate inequality to the rate of growth of an economy, all those theoretical models were based on inequality of wealth, inequality of human capital, but not necessarily on the inequality of final income. So instead of looking at the relationship between the right-hand side and GDP growth and the GDP level, it might be much more rigorous to look at the relationship starting from the left-hand side. And this is really what has been done during the end of the 90s and the 2000s, with many people finding micro-evidence, not macro, not aggregate evidence in terms of cross-country work, but micro-evidence of some inequality of opportunities which were completely inefficient. And we understand that very easily. I mean, if there is some credit rationing, if some people can undertake the investment project that they want because they have access to the credit market, because they have collateral to have access to the credit market, and if other people cannot because they don't have the collateral, it may be the case that the second group of people may have very profitable investment opportunities that will not be implemented, although that are very profitable for them and for society, and instead much more mediocre projects will be undertaken by people who have access to the credit or who have the wealth to start those projects. So in a very, very simple, minor argument, you can say the same thing about kids going to school. we know very well that very talented school kids are not going to secondary school or senior secondary school, basically because the parents cannot afford that. And they cannot go to see a bank and ask the bank to lend money to pay for the school. It will not work. So again, this is clearly an inefficiency. And if it were possible to correct for that, if talented kids, whatever their family background, were allowed to go to upper secondary school and to the university, probably the whole society would be more efficient and would be using in a more efficient way the resources in the educational system. So this has been a very important movement in academic research, trying to show that there were many situations of this type. But of course, the difficulty of that is that it is very uneasy to aggregate this micro-evidence of inequality of opportunities and to say this country is more unequal in terms of opportunities to that other country, or that country has become more unequal over time or less unequal over time. Why? Simply because it is very difficult to observe opportunities in the sense of access to justice, access to credit, access to health care. How do we measure that? Second, because we would have to put together those various opportunities. How do we aggregate access to health care, access to schooling, and access to credit or to justice? How do we aggregate that? What is the weight that will be given to those various components? Because of that, it is extremely difficult and conceptually difficult and almost impossible, I would say, nowadays, to get an indicator of the inequality of opportunities and to get into the same kind of analysis that was done with the outcome or with the income inequality. Some people are working in that direction. There is a recent paper on the United States where people claim, I'm not completely convinced myself, but they claim that they have shown that comparing the various states in the United States, when they try to explain the rate of growth of the various states by the degree of inequality, and when inequality they are making a distinction between inequality within groups of people defined by ethnicity, skin color, of course, education of the parents, etc., they find that what matters is really these differences across groups more than the differences of income within those groups. So this might be a proof that indeed the opportunities play a more important role than income inequality. But this is, for the moment, very weak work. It needs to be very much strengthened, and let's hope that this will be possible. Okay, we should not be surprised by the fact that there is no unambiguous aggregate inequality development relationship when we look at inequality of outcomes. When we go from development to inequality of outcomes, there are so many things which can play a role in that relationship that it is difficult to say a priori the development will make a country more or less unequal in terms of outcomes. And in the first place, we have to accept the fact that countries, governments might modify the distribution of income that result from the working of the market, and by itself this will make difficult to identify any general relationship. In the same way, we can say that those people who have tried to relate inequality to the rate of growth, they had in mind inequality of opportunities, but they looked at inequality of income as a proxy for opportunities. But we know that this may be a very bad proxy, and my story about the perception of inequality may show that conceptually this might not be the right thing to look at. So there should be no surprise to see that there is no strong empirical cross-country relationship in this area, simply because there is a fundamental problem of measurement of observability. I'm getting late, so I'm not sure that I want really to spend too much time on that. Okay, one quick remark. The difficulty with the evidence that is available, which I said was a micro-evidence. For example, micro-evidence, some people have worked on the rate of return to capital in informal small firms in various countries in the world. Mexico, Brazil, several countries. And they found that the rate of return in those tiny businesses was extremely high. 100, 150% for one unit being invested. Now, this is conceivable only if the capital market is extremely imperfect. Because if it was possible for those people to borrow, then of course they would be expanding their operations and they would make a lot of money. So this kind of evidence is available. And we have plenty of it around. The problem that we don't know at the macro level what would be the impact of that. We know that because of the imperfection of the credit market, there is less efficiency in micro units. But if we aggregate that, if we say, let's spend N million dollars in microcredit operations, subsidizing microcredit operations, would it make a big difference if we were to spend the N million dollars in infrastructure? We don't know. And this is a kind of aggregate evidence that is missing really to move very decidedly in the direction pointed by this kind of work. The second point, which I think is important, is the fact that, and because I will talk about redistribution, I think it is really very important. When we look at opportunities, it is difficult to think about redistributing opportunities. Think about human capital. You have people who are unequal because some of them were born in families which were able to afford schooling until the university, and others, they had to leave school after primary. Is it possible to redistribute human capital among those people? Clearly not. If we think about access to a credit market, is it possible to say from a day to the next, you are very rich, but from now on you won't be able to undertake projects or to borrow money from a bank, and you are very poor and you'll be able to borrow money from the bank. You cannot redistribute. The only thing you can do, you can accumulate among poor people. And this is really what, when we talk about, when we refer to inequality of opportunities, we are not in inequality of income where it is possible to tax some people and to give a benefit to other people, to redistribute, indeed, the current income from rich to poor. We cannot do that with opportunities. What we can do with opportunities is to accumulate among the people who, to start with, have very little. So to accumulate human capital among the poor people, to provide microcredit to poor people, to provide access to justice, access to health care to poor people, which is not exactly the same thing as redistributing. And it's very important because this means that behind this equalization of opportunities, there is also some accumulation of opportunities taking place. And whether it will be the accumulation that will be producing faster growth, or whether it is the fact that we have a more equal distribution of opportunities that will produce faster growth, is not completely clear. So this distinction, I believe, is really important. Now, let me get, in the remaining 10 minutes, let me get to policies. This is again the circle that I have shown before. Now what I want to see is a kind of policies that can influence what is going on in the various parts of that circle. The first kind of policy is really the standard, I just mentioned it, standard redistribution policy, taxes and transfers to poor people, taxes maybe to the whole population, preferably on richer people, and in that way we have a more equal distribution. Now this would be the most standard way of redistributing income. We know that this may have an impact on the working of the economic system per se, and many people would insist on the fact that this will introduce distortions in the way in which the economy works, and this will make the economy less efficient. In particular, if you start taxing the income of rich people, those people will have less incentive to invest in businesses which are profitable to them, but also profitable for the society, and because of that, the economy will not grow as fast because there will be less investment. Other people say this is completely rubbish. Those people, in any case, invest whatever they want, and they have enough income for not being affected by the tax rate. Then we should not take that argument into account. And as a matter of fact, there are also taxes which correct for existing market failures. So taxes and transfers may go in the two directions. And this is what I indicated here, saying that in the market mechanisms you may have distortions, but you may also, through taxes and transfers, correct some existing market failures. This is the first type of intervention by a government that will modify the relationship between inequality and development. Second type of intervention is in this upper arrow there. And I would call that efficiency enhancing public spending on human capital, education, healthcare, possibly housing, possibly microfinance, possibly social protection in general, trying to protect people against unexpected shocks on their living. And all this is facilitating to some extent the accumulation of factors in the poorest part of the economy. If the state decides to spend more on education, it will not be benefiting necessarily to the upper part of the distribution. It will be possibly benefiting to people who don't have access to good schooling, good quality schooling to start with. So we see that this efficiency enhancing public spending goes through the opportunity side. It is improving equality, and it is improving the working of the economy through increasing opportunities and making those opportunities more equal. And finally, there is another way we can modify the distribution, and we can modify this complex relationship between inequality and development. It is through the regulation of markets, or possibly through deregulation of markets. But we have to accept the fact that market regulation has an impact on the distribution of income and through the income on opportunities, basically because if, for example, we have a minimum wage law, we may say, fine, the minimum wage is improving the income of those people who have a job. At the same time, in developing countries, if there is a binding minimum wage, there might be less people in the formal sector of the economy, so we are restricting the access of some people to the formal sector. So on the one hand, we are gaining in terms of less income inequality. On the other hand, we may be losing in terms of introducing some inequality of opportunities, especially if there is discrimination for recruiting people in the formal sector of the economy, which pays better wages. So regulation of this type certainly have a role to play. In the same way, when a government decides to deregulate a sector which is clearly dominated by a monopoly, and the monopoly starts to charge very high prices to people for telecommunication, transport, whatever, electricity, whatever, then of course this has an impact on the distribution of real income, and through that this will have an impact on the accumulation of opportunities, the dynamics of opportunities. So these are the three areas for affecting the inequality development relationship. One of them is really standard redistribution. The second one is proper accumulation of factors. And the third one is regulating, controlling the way in which markets do behave. Now, in general, people insisted more on the first two aspects, and I will do the same thing. But I think that we should keep in mind that regulation is something important. Now, when I want to say that those instruments are essentially complements to each other. And we cannot say, as the common view holds it, that redistributing current income through taxes and transfers is in generally bad because it is generating distortion costs and therefore efficiency losses. Taxes for some people is something really bad because you are destroying incentives, and because of that the economy is not working as well as before. We have seen that if there are market failures to start with, this is not always the case, but this is a very common view about this. On the contrary, some other people find that reducing inequality of opportunities doesn't have these distortion costs. On the contrary, may correct for some market failures and will be development enhancing. So over the last couple of years, I would say, we have this kind of dualism or dichotomy between people saying redistributing income, current income is not good. We should focus on essentially redistributing opportunities. In other words, what matters is more the public spending and redistribution through public spending rather than redistribution of current income. Now, this view is a very naive and very simplistic view because practically the two sides are completely mixed. Current income redistribution may enhance human capital accumulation among the poor. If, for example, through the cash transfer programs, which are becoming so popular these days, it is possible to improve the lot of poor families, to improve their standard of living, we may expect, even if the transfers are not conditional, we may expect that those people will eat better, will have a better nutrition, will have a better health, and that kids, when they grow up, when they will be in the labor market, will be more productive and will have more human capital than it would have been the case without that. So it is certainly the case that current income redistribution has an impact on opportunities, and this is certainly not something that we want to ignore. And we want to take into account the fact that redistributing from rich income, from rich people to poor people today, might contribute to equalizing opportunities in the future. Now, on the other hand, if we want to reduce inequality of opportunities, I have said before that this cannot be done by redistribution. Even when we have in mind assets like physical assets, like land, or like financial wealth, we know that it is politically extremely difficult to redistribute land or to redistribute physical or financial wealth. So this idea of redistributing assets is difficult. What we can do, we can accumulate among the poor, but this has to be financed. If we want to improve the quality of education for poor people, the quality of schools in poor neighborhoods, if we want to have more dispensaries in poor parts of the country, we'll have to pay for that, which means that we'll have to raise taxes. And taxes mean that we will be taking from some people, probably not all the population, and we will be redistributing through this public spending on factor accumulation, we'll be redistributing to poor people, equalizing opportunities. So again, the two sides are completely combined when we take that view. So the view that there are two types of policies, pure redistribution of current income and public spending to accumulate factors among the poor, is, I believe, not well taken, and may lead to mistakes, to errors when decided about development strategies. Good policies are, of course, those where we are able to evaluate the efficiency gains, we are able to evaluate the distortion cost, and then we say, okay, this policy probably has much more gains than cost. But the other thing that we know that most likely this will be extremely context or country specific, meaning that it will be very difficult to generalize and to say in all developing countries this is what we should do. Let me give you 5 minutes. I'm stealing a little about my time. Let me finish with 2 remarks. One, the example of Brazil, which I believe is really a very remarkable example, and some remarks on development aid. Inequality in Brazil, here you have a zoom on the chart that I've shown before. This is the evolution of the Gini coefficient in Brazil since the end of the 70s. And you can see that over the last 7-8 years, and if we were to continue that curve until 2009, which is the last figure which is available, we should see that the drop is continuing. So we have a kind of historical event, which is a drop in inequality. Now, some people have tried to understand what were the causes of that drop. And one common view is that Brazil is one of those countries which implemented this conditional cash transfer program called Bolsa Familia. And the very common view is that inequality decreased because of that. This is not true. And the work done by this very well-known and very famous and very good Brazilian economist, Paes de Barros, showed that, as a matter of fact, the cash transfer, Bolsa Familia, is playing only a small role in that evolution. Other elements that are very important is the progress in education. The proportion of educated people has increased very much, and this contributes to more equality. The return to higher education has gone down because there are more people being with that level of education, and the market played its role, which again contribute to more equality. Family composition, fertility drop among poor families, very important phenomenon. People now have to share the same income with less people, and this again plays an important role. Employment rate among low-income families, we observe that in those families there are a higher share of adult people who are working than it was the case 10 years ago. And finally, less labor market discrimination. There is less differential between black and white, or depending on the colors are much more nuanced in the case of Brazil than in the case of the US, but certainly much less labor market discrimination. There you can see that you have a little of everything. Cash transfer is redistribution of current income. Education is a product of equalizing opportunities, but this is a result of a policy which has been undertaken much before today. Labor market discrimination is again improving about opportunities, and it is this whole package which we have to consider as responsible for this decline in the inequality of income in Brazil. Let me conclude with a few implications of what I've said for development aid policy. First, I would like to reiterate one very important thing, which is the ambiguity of the development policy side of aid. The view that donors can go to a country, developing countries, and say, we would like to implement this policy, and we are willing to pay for it. We would like to have this project, and we will pay for it. This view is less and less relevant over time. There is a new model of aid, which is a reaction to the excess conditionality that was imposed, in particular by international organizations in the past. And in this new model, there is a very strong ownership of policies by countries, and conditionality has not disappeared, but it can only be extremely weak, and I believe this is something that has to be kept in mind when we think about the implications of economic analysis, development analysis for policy. What can foreign donors do? They can try to promote policies, and what we have said here is simply that there is a very strong argument to increase, to enhance social policies in developing countries. Our view, if we believe what I just said today, what I summarized today, our view is that not enough is being done on this aspect of development, maybe too much done on other aspects, in particular infrastructure. Promotion by the donors through advising developing countries, through providing experts to work with their own experts, with their own policymakers, is something essential to promote this kind of message that social policies are important. At the same time, some support for financing those policies can be proposed. But again, the point is not to say, I'm giving you money for you to implement that policy. The relationship should be something of the type, if you are considering this kind of policy in your development strategy, then I might be willing to contribute to your budget by providing a little more resources. It is absolutely essential for those projects to be managed, to be designed by the governments of those countries. We complain about the fact that there is not enough accountability of those governments with respect to the population. There will be no accountability with respect to the population if everything is driven by foreign donors. So we have to accept that, and this is the constraint that donors are facing. Having said that, what is the kind of social policies that must be promoted and possibly, in the weak way I just described, finance? With what I've said, I think there are three types that has to be pushed forward. Asset accumulation among the poor, education, health, but also microcredit and other types, better access to justice, etc. This is one side or one channel through which policy can affect the circle that I have shown. Social protection, which is preventing assets which have been accumulated or which are being accumulated by the poor to be run down when there is an unexpected shock, a death in the family, a disease in the family. And from that point of view, health insurance is important. Microfinance is important because people can smooth out the shocks that they are subject to. Public employment guarantee programs, which would be the form in developing countries of unemployment insurance. All this is absolutely essential if we want to avoid the fact that standard, normal shocks like divorce, separation, sickness, death, drought would simply ruin the expectations and the asset accumulation by poor people. So this is really an important part of the whole social policy package. And finally, when we talk about redistribution, standard income redistribution, I think that there is these days very much emphasis on cash transfers, and there is very much positive things. There are many positive things to be said in favor of cash transfers, especially when we compare that to other redistribution, which channels, which are often used in the developing countries and which are clearly completely inefficient and not that redistributive. What I have in mind is all those countries which are trying to redistribute current income through subsidies to some specific goods, not realizing that it is very difficult to redistribute in any substantial way when rich people are also consuming the goods which are subsidized. And because of that, it is a very costly way to redistribute. Cash transfer, from that point of view, are doing a much better job. And it is a fantastic news, and I will end up on this, to see that transfers which were considered as not possible in developing countries some 15 years ago now have been shown to be implementable, to work, to produce results. Not everything is completely satisfactory with those programs, but it shows that redistribution in cash is possible, whereas in the past it was considered that only subsidies on prices or redistribution in in terms of goods, was the only way something could be done. So there is a large, big scope, a very broad scope for intervention in the social policy area. Foreign donors can be influential without necessarily imposing anything, which is something that they cannot do. And I think that this may provide nice guidelines, I hope, for thinking about what development aid policy should be in our countries. And thank you very much.